shred is dead.
What are you talking about?
Now, I know right away people are going to be going, what are you talking about? Shred is alive and well in the music world. But at one time it wasn't. And I remember it well to the point where I stopped playing guitar for a while.
No way.
Way.
I know that might be shocking for some people, but it actually made me stop. So what happened, there was an issue of Guitar World that came out November 1993. I have it somewhere. I just can't seem to find it. But I remember that issue very well. Cover on it was Joe Satriani. And I kind of think this sort of foreshadowed to what was going to happen at that time. So we know that grunge sort of killed off hair metal from the late 80s, early 90s. But nu metal more or less killed the guitar solo for a while. So I grew up in the late 80s where there was a lot of shred guitar going on. So we had, of course, the pioneers like Eddie Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, Yngwie Malmsteen, who brought the neoclassical element to a lot of shred playing. And shred was cool. Of course, you had a lot of hair metal bands where you had to have a really good shredding lead guitar player. And I loved that of that era. I loved even groups like Winger, White Lion. You had just so much shred happening. And then the grunge era came in and kind of changed everything. You had groups like Metallica with the Load and Reload albums that were really more blues rock based. You had groups like even like Skid Row with a Subhuman album, I think it was, and it was more grungy-ish in a way. You had even Warrant, a hair metal band that kind of did the Dog Eat Dog, I think, album is when they started kind of changing their format. So it was kind of, the landscape was changing. Now with grunge, you still had guitar solos. So you had like, Soundgarden, you had Pearl Jam, you had my favorite of that era, which is Alice in Chains, where you still had guitar solos, but it was more of a lighter bluesy rock based type of thing, really for that type of music, right? It wasn't really heavy, aggressive stuff. So when grunge sort of came in, I kind of changed gears a little bit and went to death metal for a while because of course you still had really great shred playing. And it kind of, I had to change my thought process of shred guitar, and it got me into a whole other genre of music in a way, which was good because you had bands like Carcass, you had Death, you had Morbid Angel, you had Cannibal Corpse, that there was really good shred metal still happening. But when nu metal came in, everything changed. When Korn especially came in, although they had really heavy riffs, that, the 7-string downtune thing happening, there was no guitar solos. And what happened is it kind of influenced what the bands would be doing after that. And I remember this as clear as day. It was 1996. I was playing a gig, and of course, I loved metal. I grew up playing Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Testament, all stuff that had really good shred. But I had to play punk in my hometown of Sault Ste. Marie because not a lot of people were playing metal anymore. Punk was kind of the thing. So at that time, I was playing in a punk metal crossover band where I was playing solos. And I remember playing a show, and it was 1996, and it was a newer song, I believe we were playing, and I had a ripping guitar solo in it. And I remember as soon as the solo was starting, and I remember looked out towards the front row, and I remember seeing somebody roll their eyes at me and turn away. And it was like, really? That I'm doing my best here, like whether it fit the song and whatnot, but then I noticed that the landscape was really changing. And people were starting to tell me not to play solos. And it was like unfashionable to play solos, play shredding guitar solos. And that really kind of depressed me in a way because not too long after that, I remember I got let go from the group and they brought in back the original guitar player that I replaced who couldn't play solos to go back to playing their songs without guitar solos. And not too long after that, I remember I was trying to do a thrash metal band playing Metallica, Slayer, Creator, Sacrifice, play some really good metal stuff. And we couldn't get gigs. Nobody was interested in booking us shows. It was just so uncool to play that kind of metal to shred guitar. And of course, my main rig at that time was a 5150 half stack, one of the original ones. And my main guitar was an Ibanez RG 570. And I got so down. Of course, life was happening for me at that time. I was already in my early 20s that I sold all my gear. And I remember I had long hair all through high school. And up to this time, I had long hair.
Hey there, stud muffin.
And I cut all my hair off, sold all my gear, and I went to college. I was sort of done with music for at that time, and I didn't even think I'd ever go back to it. But what had happened is by the time the 2000s came, I sort of got the itch, and I wanted to play. And I took up bass for a while. I was a bass player for a while, and I like Korn. I love Korn. They're one of my favorite bands, but there was no guitar solos. So I thought, you know what? I'll play bass. That'll get me by. I'll play bass. There was some cool bass stuff that was going on. And of course, when I look back now, that I'm so glad that I still kept some sort of music going, but would really kind of change. So it was unfashionable in the late 1990s to early 2000s to play guitar solos. And if you even remember at that time, like you had bands like Tool, you had bands like Chevelle, Papa Roach. They didn't have solos, at least not in the early stuff that they did. But around the mid 2000s to later 2000s, the landscape changed. And it wasn't until I realized this, until I remember I had moved back to Ontario. I was living in Mississauga, and my cousin took me to a Gigantour. And I remember Megadeth, who was one of my favorite bands growing up. I remember they came out and they had a new lead guitar player. Now, I thought they still had Glenn, and he was a great guitar player on his own. But when Chris Broderick came out for Tornado of Souls, which is one of my all-time favorite guitar solos, and he had this, I was like, how many strings are on that guitar? And he came out with this 8-finger tapping thing for the intro of Tornado of Souls. And I was like, what is this guy doing? And of course, he played brilliant on that. And then I got introduced to groups like Children of Bodom. Alexi, man, that guy could shred. Nevermore, Jeff Loomis, who could absolutely shred. And he's still one of my favorite guitar players now since. And it kind of woke me up that, hey, shred guitar is cool again. And all of a sudden, the revival started, I think, around that time. And it brought me back into it. Now, I know before this was going on, like one of my all-time favorite bands growing up was Machine Head. I remember in 1995, I saw them on Much Music. And I remember that I love the heaviness of that band. It was, the groove metal element was coming in, but it was even their first two albums were really nice and heavy. And then they had gone more nu metal-ish through the Burning Red and Supercharger eras. And it wasn't kind of until Phil Demmel came into Machine Head. They had Rue left the group, who, played on the third and fourth albums, wasn't much of a shredder at all. And then Phil came in, and I remember when In Through the Ashes of Empires came in, that album, and all of a sudden you had a song like In the Presence of My Enemies come, and with just that great solo that he played, like a ripping solo, and I thought, oh wow, this is great. We got great solos, shreddy solos starting to happen again. And even Dimebag Darrell at that time even told Phil, and this is documented all over the place, that Phil brought the shred back to Machine Head. And I loved that at that time. And it kind of did in a way, because it was starting to be cool again to be shredding and metal. And it brought me back more into wanting to be a guitar player again. And I started getting back into playing lead and shredding and whatnot, collecting guitars. And nowadays, I really enjoy where the state of metal is at, because especially on YouTube now, so many people are putting up their videos of shredding guitar stuff. and it is alive more than ever. It did a full circle, and we've got so many great shredders of this time that I'm so glad to see it. And of course, I've discovered so many newer bands. Of course, around that time too, with that Gigantour, I remember Lamb of God and Unleash the Archer, or not Unleash the Archers, what's the other one? Arch Enemy came about, and I remember I really liked their stuff too that they were doing. And I was like, hey man, we got some shred stuff. We got sweeping came cool. Yngwie Malmsteen sort of brought it about in the mid 80s, but really it was like when I saw Chris Broderick employing it with the Endgame album and whatnot, I was like, oh, it's cool to do like really shreddy, really sweep picking and whatnot kind of solos. And then nowadays, like it's really like I love Trivium is one of my favorite newer bands. So for me, they're newer because I only discovered them like 5-6 years ago, really. I had heard of them before, but I'd really gotten into them the last while. And the same with Unleash the Archers. I love that band as well. And that they employ especially 7-string guitars now, and those guys can really shred their asses off. And I love the state of where music has gone to now. And then when I look back now, playing, when I listen to the music from the 80s, early 90s, I'm happy that it's cool for me now. I play in a cover band again where I can shred. I can do a lot of the shredding stuff, especially the hair metal era stuff that shreds. And that's great for us, what we're doing in Driven to 11. And for that, it's kind of pushed me in wanting to do another solo album now. So I've been starting to kind of go over the music that I have in my laptop that I've been saving up for so long. It's interesting because some of the stuff I have, I remember showing it to my old singer and even 2 singers ago in another metal band, and they'd be like, how do you put lyrics over that? And I'm like, man, and then I think about it, I'm like, this is the stuff that's more instrumental. It's much more intricate, much more metal than a lot of the other stuff that I was writing. So I'm kind of glad that I've kind of gotten back to wanting to do instrumental stuff. Like Passion and Warfare by Steve Vai is still one of my all-time favorite metal albums that I've always wanted. I did my own solo album at one point, but I'm going to do another one. I've got a theme down. I've got ideas for it. I've got a lot of riffs I'm going over now to start writing something. So that'll come out probably, I'm hoping, by the end of this year, and that'll be cool. So, but other than that, when I look back now, before the death of shred guitar in the mid 90s, some of my favorite albums of that time, when I think about it, was like Megadeth, Rust in Peace, definitely one of my favorite ones. Metallica's Injustice for All, huge influence on me. I think that's Kirk's best playing for solo work. Pantera's Cowboys from Hell, like, come on, that is just one of those albums where he was like, Dime wasn't into like sweep picking kind of shred. He had a really tasteful way of shredding. And then he had a lot of like the Eddie Van Halen-ish type of runs. And then he had his own thing, especially his really good legato work that he would do with his left hand. He was really great for that. Alex Skolnick of Testament was one of my favorite shredders through the mid to late 80s to the early 90s. Even they started changing a little bit when the grunge era came in for that what's the one album I can't remember, The Ritual. There we go, The Ritual album. Even then, and he left the band to go play jazz. And of course, with the resurgence of metal, he came back to Testament there in the late 2000s, right? So that kind of, as soon as he went back to Testament to play metal again, I said, hey, you know what? Something's going on. It's cool again. But when other shred metal, like especially sweep picking, fast alternate picking, Forbidden is another one. Twisted into Form is another one of my favorite albums. Death metal wise, I think one of my favorite death metal albums was actually Morbid Angel's Covenant album. Trey's so unorthodox. He can really play fast, sweep picking, but the way he played everything, it was just out of this world. That I loved a lot of what he did. So those are kind of my favorite albums, I would say, from my formative years of playing, of learning shred. Especially when you're younger, you're learning how to play, you're learning how to shred and do a lot of that. So, but anyway, so that'll be it for this Rageous Ramblings for this week. Next week, I have a special guest that we're going to have a whole discussion on the death of the CD format. So watch out for that next week with my special guest. And until then, shred on. Take care.